Seb moved mechanically to the kitchen, retrieving a giant bottle of Coke and a bottle of stout. It was his ritual, one he had carried out every night after dinner. It gave him a small sense of control in a life that felt increasingly unsteady. The kitchen light flickered slightly as he placed the bottles on the table. The familiar clink of glass against wood filled the silence. Mrs. Akobundu had brought him some food, which he ate without enthusiasm. The rest he placed in the fridge, as if saving it for a hunger he wasn't sure would come. She watched him, sensing that the weight on his shoulders had grown heavier. Seb and Mrs. Akobundu sat at the dining table, the quiet between them no longer strained as it had been during the height of his relationship with Blessing. They had returned to their old closeness, at least as much as the scars of the past would allow. There was an understanding between them, a shared exhaustion from witnessing too much. Seb shook his head as if clearing the fog in his mind. He seemed ready to finally speak his truth. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of pain as he began. We had a serious disagreement on the evening of her birthday party. His hands tightened around the glass of stout, his eyes distant. I decided not to bring up the issue again, but she gave me an ultimatum, matron. An ultimatum. Mrs. Akobundu remained silent, letting him unravel his story in his own time. She went ahead with her action, of course to humiliate me. What was the point of tackling her? It would just lead to an own goal. His chuckle was bitter. And to be honest, I did not want to be reminded of what her rich senator could do for her and what I couldn't. All the things I was incapable of doing for her. Seb sighed, running a hand over his face. Blessing has been avoiding me. She hasn't been to the house for weeks. His tone was dismissive, but there was something hollow in it. It never bothered me. It seems Blessing fears reality. That's why she hates the truth. I realized this a few days after she came into my life. Mrs. Akobundu watched him carefully, noting the contradiction between his words and his appearance. Outwardly, he tried to project indifference, but something had shifted in him. He was not the same man. Mrs. Akobundu stared at the man before her, the man who had once abandoned his wife and children in England for Blessing. She had seen how the entire health center had bowed to Blessing, granting her everything she wanted, whenever she wanted it, simply because of her connection to Seb. And now, she was gone. In Seb's eyes, she saw the disappointment, the anger, the slow realization of all he had lost. She thought she mattered to me, he muttered under his breath. She really thought she did. Mrs. Akobundu didn't respond. What was there to say? She had seen it all before. The rise, the fall, the bitter aftermath. And now, Seb was left to pick up the pieces. He was staring at the dark liquid in his glass, swirling it absent-mindedly. The words from Mrs. Akobundu echoed in his mind. It was always about Blessing and no one else. Nothing was good enough for her. Now she's gone off with that Chief Nboli. You must not take it. You must at least say something to them. Give them a piece of your mind. Let them know that you're no fool. He clenched his jaw. What was the point? What would it change? He already knew what Chief Nboli must be thinking. That Seb was powerless. That there was nothing he could do. And that knowledge stung worse than the betrayal itself. It was an affair they had. So what is the big problem? Seb's voice was calm, but the tightness in his grip betrayed him. She was not my wife, and we were not even engaged. As far as I'm concerned, Chief Nboli is welcome to her. He threw back the rest of his drink, the bitterness of it burning his throat. With a sudden, sharp motion, he thumped the empty glass against the table, letting his fingers linger on it for a few seconds before releasing. Mrs. Akobundu remained silent. She wasn't fooled. She could see it. His clenched jaw, the way his nostrils flared slightly, the furrow in his brow. He was seething. It didn't matter what words he spoke. The fury was written all over his face. Mrs. Akobundu sighed, shaking her head. "That man is a disgrace," she muttered. "I hate him for what he did. I hate him for what he is." Seb looked up at her. "He's just like every other politician. They think their money and power mean they can take whatever they want, no matter who they trample on in the process." She wasn't surprised by what Chief Nboli had done. No, it was expected. The only thing shocking was how quickly he had turned on Seb, despite once calling him a friend. Now, Nboli had started a quiet but vicious campaign against Seb, whispering in the ears of anyone who would listen. "He's a man who wants to turn this place into England," he would say. "Ungrateful," he sneered, as if bringing Seb to the health center had made him his property. A staff member had even told her that Nboli had threatened to replace Seb with an Indian doctor, just to prove a point. It was pathetic. But this was the way of men like Nboli. When they were caught in their own web of lies and disgrace, they did not retreat. They attacked. They smeared. They turned the narrative around so that they became the victims, and anyone who opposed them became the villain. And somehow, it worked every time. It was Saturday morning. Seb had not slept well. The night had been a violent symphony of thunder and lightning, the sky roaring as if in protest. Rain pelted down on the iron roof like a cascade of pebbles, loud and relentless. By morning, he wandered aimlessly around his small apartment, unwashed, still in his dressing gown. He moved like a hospital patient lost in the corridors of his own thoughts. The television buzzed in the background, broadcasting a political program he wasn't really watching. In the kitchen, cups and plates sat in the sink, untouched. He pulled his dressing gown tighter around him, as if it could shield him from his own thoughts. The road outside was steaming under the morning sun, the wet asphalt releasing ghostly wisps of vapor. An ache settled in his chest. He needed to call his family in England, but even the thought of that exhausted him. A sharp knock at the door, the click of the lock turning. Seb didn't move. The door swung open, and there she was, Blessing. She walked in like she owned the space. Her makeup was flawless, her lipstick a perfect shade of power. He had not been expecting her. He did not want to see her, and he certainly did not need this right now. He remained frozen in place, his body heavy with exhaustion. His eyes did not lift to meet hers. His lips did not part to greet her. There was nothing to say, nothing to forgive, nothing to discuss. A sudden, unwelcome image forced its way into Seb's mind. Blessing and Chief Nboli tangled in the sheets. Disgust clawed at his stomach, and he willed the thought away. She was here for a reason, no doubt, but whatever it was, he didn't care. Blessing and the Chief were made for each other. They were the human embodiment of everything wrong with the country, living for wealth status, and appearances that were as hollow as their morals. He wasn't bitter. No, he was simply seeing things for what they were. Blessing would sacrifice anyone to get ahead, and she had proven that. Seb sat motionless, his mind set. He wanted her gone. The sooner Blessing was out of his life, the faster her memory would fade, dissolving into nothingness. Blessing, ever perceptive, picked up on his body language immediately. "I've come to collect my things, Seb." He didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't even nod. He had expected this moment, rehearsed it in his head countless times. For the first time, he accepted that everything Mrs. Akobundu and the other nurses had said was true. She had no remorse, no explanation, not a single apology. Blessing always claimed to be a devout Christian. She was the first to rush forward when the pastor needed funds. Her tithe was never late, and yet she had given in to the chief without hesitation. Not even a flicker of guilt, not even a moment of resistance. She had the body of a model, but not a single bone of chastity. Seb clenched his jaw, his back still turned to her. There was no marriage to salvage, no assets to dispute. They had nothing left to fight for. She was a stranger now, a woman who had once occupied his space and was now just retrieving the last of her things. Blessing walked briskly into the bedroom, her heels clicking against the floor. No hesitation, no looking back. Seb didn't move. He heard the rustling of bags, the sound of zippers, and the hurried footsteps of someone eager to erase the past. Minutes later, she emerged, her face unreadable. She dropped the house keys on the table without a word. She loaded her Jeep quickly. No small talk, no drama. It was clinical. A surgical removal of something that had once mattered but no longer did. She drove off. Even an illegal squatter, warned of an impending police raid, wouldn't have moved faster. Seb exhaled deeply, listening as the engine roared to life. The sound of her departure faded into the distance, and with it, the last trace of what they had.